Welcome, friends. Thanks for accepting the invitation to Hockey in the East. I'm your host, John Lokka. I was just finishing up this week's read, The Oddfellow's Heart by Morey Holzman. It was an interesting read about the transition from amateur to professional hockey and the origin of our modern NHL rules. You know, you're just in time because I invited Morey over to talk about his book. There he is now. Welcome, Morey. Would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself before we get into the book?
About 30 years ago, I was a journalist and worked in newspapers for 5 years, worked as a reporter, decided that I didn't really want to live the life. So I got out of it, but I never gave up the writing. So it was kind of like a hobby, spare time. I like to do investigative journalism into hockey and its history. It was growing up. I had lots of stories that I heard, and they almost sounded unbelievable. Come to find out, a lot of them were made up. But it pushed an interest button to me, and it allowed me to just kind of explore and try to figure out how this crazy game we all love from all over the globe came to be.
Yeah, and that's a great point, right? Because I know your first book, which collaborated on the research of another famous seer person, focused on kind of the evolution of the NHA into the NHL. And for this book here, you focused on the transition from amateurism into professionalism. And is that kind of why you chose that the end of amateurism is around 1904, 1905?
Well, I hate to put that as a kind of like a hard and fast rule, because amateurism was never really truly amateurism. If you wanted to really put the end of it, I would probably say 1895, 1896 was the end of pure amateurism. That's where money started coming into it one way or the other. There's a story that I talk about in Oddfellow's Heart where Jimmy Stewart ended up making enemies with his teammates because a stick company in Montreal wanted to give the team free sticks in return of them saying that we were the official stick of the Montreal AAA. And Jimmy Stewart felt that that was professionalism. And the other players are like, well, why should we be paying for the sticks and the ice time and everything else? So that to me was kind of like the I don't want to say it's the straw that broke the camel's back, but that started the slippery slope into professionalism. And then what you actually call professionalism, I think, is kind of open to the interpretation. But it certainly wasn't beer league hockey at that point.
So for you, any kind of recompense for any kind of playing activity would be considered professionalism and end of amateurism, whether it be free ice time, free sticks, free train travel, or reimbursement on train travel and travel, correct?
No, I'm not so sure for me personally, I'm not so sure I would put the line. For Jimmy Stewart, that was the line. For me personally, it gets a little bit dicey because now all of a sudden you're paying people to have jobs and overpaying them to do the jobs and giving them time off of work so they can go travel and play hockey. I mean, is that professionalism? It's not direct, but they wouldn't have had the job offer if they weren't a good hockey player.
So, right, and you raise that up with Tom Green in your book, right? That kind of concept where one player asked for his time off, he got it from his employer, but Tom Green couldn't because he was a Native American First Nations person,
right,
and struggled with making in money enough to run the AHAC.
Correct. Yeah.
Good. So, and that kind of gets me back into a little bit of the thesis that I wanted to talk about in your book. And for me, the thesis really kind of fell on page 81, the last paragraph of 81, which bleeds into 82, right? Which talks about how Jimmy Stewart and the three other people really sat down to write the rules and rewrite the rules into getting close to what the game is today. Would you say that that's kind of accurate?
Close to today, or the foundation for today's game? If you change that question to the foundation of today's game, I would say yes, that's accurate. The game that was being played for the 12 years prior to the rules being written, the rules were all over the map. And to the point where somebody would travel in time 12 years, they wouldn't even recognize it as the same sport. But if you go back in time to 1886, outside of the fact that the play is really, really slow, you would at least see a lot of the same elements of what we watch today. Everything from the puck to the size of the arena, to the size of the goal, to skating. Skating wasn't really much of an element in the early years. It was an element, but it wasn't like they were stick handling with the puck skating down the ice. It was kind of more like a bunch of 6-year-olds playing. As an experiment, one of the things that I did was I went to my local arena here, which is just closed up thanks to COVID. But I went to my local arena, and there was some kids out there playing broom hockey. I went out and I found a wooden puck, basically a wooden block from a hardware store, and I took a wooden stick that I had, and I went out to shoot the wooden puck with the wooden stick to see how far it would actually move. And it didn't really go far, maybe went 20, 25 feet. I gave it to the kid. I gave it to a 15-year-old who would have been about the same size as an adult in those days, and tried to have him hit it as hard as he could. Again, 20, 25 feet. It wasn't the same game. It was very rudimentary.
And with that being said, sorry if I kind of missed this. Did you say that was on an ice surface?
Yes.
Okay. And recognizing that today's ice surface is, especially if it's for ice rink kind of material, is going to be a lot more refined than the sea or river ice that they had back then.
No. I was using a used ice arena in a sense, because they were playing broom hockey on it.
Yeah.
So it's not like the Zamboni came out and cleaned it off. It would have been pretty equivalent to what the players would have been skating on in those times.
Okay. But the reason why I bring up, like, you get so far in what I felt was like the main thesis or the main point or purpose of the book, getting that far in, I kind of got a little lost on the first about 60 or so pages. And I was trying to find, 1 to 3 or a few takeaway items of those first, 6 or 7 chapters of the book. You introduce a lot of things, and you introduce actually the reason why you called the book The Oddfellow's Heart. But I didn't feel like it really, the story didn't really start gelling until 81, page 81, or that chapter. I think that's chapter 9.
There's a lot to explain when it's very different than what we see today. And a lot of it is the motivation of the people involved. We're all in a kind of a unique situation. People's lives are changed from unique situations that happen to them uniquely. And with hockey, if Jimmy Stewart's father hadn't got a promotion, they wouldn't have moved, and his mother hadn't died previously, and they wouldn't have moved to Montreal, there still would have been hockey. But it would have been probably closer to what was played in England at the time compared to what we saw today. It would have been very different. And so understanding Jimmy Stewart, his background, his upbringing, why he was accepted by the socialites in Montreal, the kids who didn't have to go out and get a job and work 70 hours a week, that allowed him to have influence. And the fact that he won a skating race at the carnival against the Ross family, that really won him a lot of friends.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you bring that up, because I was, with my own study of amateurism, I came to realize that amateurism never exists on itself. It usually existed on top of another ethos, kind of like muscular Christianity. And you kind of seem to hint at that in your book, because you mentioned that Jimmy's father, liked to play sports and tried to instill that same concept into Jimmy, but you didn't really tie in or seem to indicate whether or not Jimmy was religious or not religious, or what else drove the ethos, because even with your own quote on what amateurism was called at the time, focuses on the fact that it's pay for play, basically, summarizing it down or distilling it down to a very simple concept, instead of this concept of a Victorian man or a Victorian gentleman who has to be well-rounded and above, is playing sport to not be a part of, the riffraff.
I think you have to be careful with history. I think what you have to do is kind of look at it in context of the times that these people were living in. And I don't know that, I think it was a different kind of currency that he was playing for. It was respect. And being allowed to be the president of the Montreal Amateur Athletic Association was a huge honor. And for them to take a commoner to allow that position, even though the hockey itself was a really minor program of the AAA, to him, that was currency. To him, that was like getting paid.
Right. But was he really a commoner by the time he was a railroad clerk, which would have been one of the better paying positions of the era?
Well, he certainly wasn't a doctor. He didn't certainly, one of the things I showed in a section about the McGill players is that each one of the McGill players had, as a minimum, 3 servants.
Mm-hmm.
They weren't necessarily hurting for money or lifestyle or work or anything like that. Where Jimmy Stewart had to basically take care of his stepmother and his sisters while providing work and giving up his own personal life to do so. Very different life. So for him to be respected, I think that's in of itself its own currency.
Oh, absolutely. And I like the idea that you did bring in Tom Green and talked a little bit about his background in the book too, to kind of also highlight how meritocracy sort of existed, right? And I'm actually bleeding in a little bit more, but it seemed like you're trying to get at meritocracy existed within the Montreal Amateur Athletic Association, whereas in the rest of society, it was still very exclusive and non-inclusionary, right? It was still very exclusive.
No. I don't think it was the AAA I'm referring to with Green. Green was an Ottawa kid. He went to McGill. He moved to Ottawa. So with Green, I think it was hockey was inclusive. The sport was inclusive, but this organization in the cities and the governing was very exclusive. And it was the governing of the prime minister that prevented Green from fulfilling his duties, more so than anything that was hockey related.
Really? So I thought that you mentioned that Tom Green was elected or was in the senior position of the AAHC.
He was the first president. So, and then his job, quote unquote, his job ended up taking him out to the middle of Saskatoon.
Okay. So I apologize for misspeaking a little bit there. It seems like I am saying or mirroring what you're talking about, right? Which is that the sport of hockey was inclusive based upon meritocracy. The governing body of hockey at that time, the major governing body of hockey at the time, was willing to accept meritocracy into its ranks, but it was the rest of society that was very exclusionary.
If you put quotes around society, yes.
Well, right. Yeah. So with all that also being kind of said, is I think one thing that I walked away a little bit disappointed from the book. Overall, I think all the research is great. So this disappointment, I don't know if it's mine or not, but Jimmy Stewart felt like he was a significant but minor player in a cast of other characters. And that developed and played along with the rules. And I didn't get the sense that the book really honed in on some it highlighted some potentially promising avenues, but it didn't really draw them out in the narration of some of the games. And, it would have been really nice to see additional material about Jimmy Stewart's time as the AHAC president and how he led it over those 4 years.
Fair criticism. One of the things I did before publication was I had the book peer reviewed by a couple of professors. And one of the things that they brought up was, if you could show that he was that involved with like minutes of a meeting, something like that. And I thought that was a really fair criticism. The problem is that there were no records. Where the offices were located was burned in a fire in 1897. So do you let this history that we do know or that I was able to find escape? Or do you at least put it out there and say, okay, hey, look, this is what is. So maybe, one of the things with Jimmy Stewart is he never had family. He never had his own family. A lot of the times, which we've seen time and time again, especially with some of the children and descendants of the earlier years, like Kenny Mallon's grandkids, where they will make the point and make the argument for their family members. Like Kenny's grandchildren try to get him into the Hall of Fame, that kind of thing. When you don't have any family, there's nobody to speak up. And Jimmy Stewart didn't really keep diaries. It wasn't like there was a written record from him. I actually had to do a lot of research just to make sure that I had the same guy, that it was the right guy. That name in itself was quite common in Montreal. Mm-hmm. There was a professor at McGill named James Stewart. there was there was a sports editor named James Stewart, and I had to make sure that the hockey with McGill and the sports editor were different James Stewarts than another James Stewart. There was also a James Stewart that grew up near Brockville, who ended up being a minister under the Laurier administration, and he was a minister of trains. And I had to make sure that that wasn't the same James Stewart, who previous to his job with the trains was also a hockey coach.
Mm-hmm.
So, there's a lot of anonymity with him, which is why his name really wasn't brought up, except who was he? The evidence that I was able to find, I presented.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't want to make any outlandish statements that I really couldn't back up with the evidence. I suspect, if you're asking for an opinion, I suspect he did a lot more than what I wrote about, that he was the glue. But I don't, the evidence is not, it doesn't exist. One of the things, for example, was that the players of the AAA, when they won the Stanley Cup, got Stanley Cup rings. Stewart was the one who ordered it. His ring has never been located.
Mm.
Now, did he sell it? Did he melt it down for money? Did he, it certainly wasn't buried with him. I thought I had a lead in the sense that even though this is 2021, when he was living in Seattle in 1943, he had a housemate that he lived with for 8 years. And a gentleman by the name of Floyd Ramsden. And Floyd passed away about in 1960, but his widow was still alive. And so I tried to contact her in Seattle, ironically, in the same neighborhood they lived. And ironically, a mile away from the Climate Pledge Arena. But she's at the point now where her memory is gone. I asked her nephews to interview her for me, because sometimes with family, you can get a little bit of more of an easier conversation going. And unfortunately, as was happens in a lot of the times, the husband and wife never really talked about the husband's life before the marriage. So even though Floyd had lived with Jim Stewart for 9 years, there was nothing there. There was no information that I could get that felt credible.
Now, I would like to kind of go back and look at one little aspect, since you talked about the difficulty of tracking down information. I really appreciated you highlighting the Montreal Gazette article about mentioning, Jimmy Stewart and those who rewrote the rules. But I didn't see the connection on where Robertson asked or directed or, how Robertson got involved in telling Jimmy Stewart and those group of people to rewrite the rules.
Well, again, minutes are lost. So Robertson announced to the media that we're going to do this. He gets 4 guys together. They have a meeting. They do it. Next day, rules are published.
Okay, so that was in potentially either I missed it in that one article or it came out in an earlier article.
No, it was in there.
Okay, so I must have missed it.
That's all right. I don't have it memorized. It's been a while.
It was a fairly lengthy article, most of it covering the rules section before it said, and here's who rewrote the rules, and then it kind of went on.
Yeah. Well, they had a first set of rules that they worked from for the first year tournament, and then they kind of tweaked it a little bit before the full season started.
Yeah, and weren't those the Crichton rules?
No, the Crichton rules had several changes to them.
Okay. Yeah. Well, so I know that Crichton worked on those rules from the time he first kind of proposed them with the 9-man, the crazy 9-man squads on each side of the ice to kind of where we think of modern hockey, which I guess would be right around this time. But I've never tracked that transition in those rules. So I was kind of looking forward to seeing that story arc in your book play out a little bit more, but it doesn't even look like there is a connection. There was Crichton who did his own thing. And then there's another set of general rules outside the NSA rules. And then finally there's the Jimmy Stewart.
And there was a whole game being played in England under a whole completely different set of rules too at the same time.
Yeah.
The one thing with this rule book that was different though, was this rule book was distributed. It wasn't just printed in the newspaper. They printed up and sent copies of it. Copies went down to Toronto. Copies went to Winnipeg. Copies went east. And so they were able to unify the rules that which everybody was playing over a period of time.
Okay. Yeah, and I know that also in the United States, what originally was called hockey would be transformed into ice polo.
Right.
So yeah,
And
it's interesting seeing some of those cross pollinations from the Origins book.
Yeah, and there
okay.
were tours. There were famous tours that were famous at the time in the region.
And there was another point that I thought that you had a chance to really kind of expand upon that I've been hoping to see more of is, and it may be covered in other books that I haven't addressed yet, but McGill was an English university, and all of this hockey development with Crichton, with all these people, with the other McGill players, were all focused on, here you have an English enclave in the middle of French Quebec, and you kind of allude to the tensions there with the breakout of the smallpox, but I don't think you really expanded or clearly stated that story arc.
Well, again, you can't look at today's Montreal and compare that to 1880s Montreal as the same Montreal. I mean, it is, but it isn't. Montreal was much more English at that time. It wasn't, there were a lot of English, there were a lot of French, and they lived side by side on the island, but it was, French were on one side, English was another. So when they did the carnival, the French part of Montreal knew about it. It was certainly in the French papers, but it wasn't for the French population to take part of. It was the English population that took part of it for the most part. There were bilingual people who were French who were there, but by and large, it was the carnival was for English to attract Americans to come to the city in the middle of the winter, or from people from Ottawa to come over, etc. It wasn't really designed to be a cultural phenomenon or a bicultural phenomenon.
Well, but even the development of hockey outside of the carnival seemed to focus on the English-speaking portion of Montreal, until you almost get Maurice Richard and that.
You'd have to check with Michel Vigneault on that, because he's the one who's the specialist in French hockey. But from my talking with him, I want to say that the first real French team came in like 1903, or it was really late 1890s, early 1900s.
Yeah.
The French weren't really a player in this. For starters, they had large families and didn't have servants. So,
yep.
Yeah, reducing the work week to 70 hours made a difference too.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine, them crying, because like I said, I've been doing a lot of study in this area between England, United States, and in a lesser degree Canada, and hearing about the first the 10-hour work week demands, the 12 or 10-hour work days, because they were working 14 and then go down to 12, and England comes up and there's several people there with the 8-hour workday demand, but it gets shrunk down to 10. So but yeah, and so exploring some other larger themes about the book, is there anything that you wish that you could have potentially added or changed? Every book has, we always have to finish the product or even if it's incomplete, but is there something that you would have liked to expand upon outside the book?
I really took my time with it, and I had it reviewed. I had it reviewed by a few people, a couple professors, a couple of people whom I really respect, historic, who were knowledgeable in that time period. And, I took their feedback and I implemented what I could. So I don't really have any regrets for what I printed. Now, were there stuff that would make that a better book? Oh, absolutely. Find the minutes that burned up in the fire. Find Jimmy Stewart's ring. Find out what happened to him between 1900 and 1943. Find out, did he go to the hockey games in Seattle when they were winning the Stanley Cup? He certainly wasn't involved in any of the organizations. He moved to Houghton, he moved to Sault Ste. Marie just as the IHL was coming in. There's no mention of him at all in either of the two Saults. Did he go to any of the games? Was he involved with Jack Gibson? Or was he just so appalled by the professionalism and where all the money was going, that he washed his hands from it. In an earlier life, I washed my hands from running a hockey organization. I ran a kids league in the mid '90s, and I don't want to badmouth the league. I thoroughly loved my time there, but there was a time where I needed to walk away from it, and I washed my hands, and I really never stepped foot back there. I understand his mentality, where he was with that, if that was his mentality. The problem is he didn't tell us, and he didn't give us kids who told us. So we can either pretend he never existed, or we can come out and say, okay, this is what we know.
Yeah. And there were others like Larry McCormick, Joe McCormick from the Pittsburgh All-Stars in the 1917, right? That when they were coming down out of the lower Ottawa River Valley, they also heard about like how Cleveland was, paying their players, and they were going to get banned by by CAHA, right? By the Canadian Amateur Hockey Association. So they went down to Pittsburgh instead because they were viewed to be clean. So Jimmy Stewart wouldn't have been alone in that era and time frame for turning his nose up at a professional league.
Well, again, I think at that time that you're talking about, Stewart would have been in his 50s. So I mean, his playing career would have been long over. Again, got to keep in mind he played until he was in his mid 30s, early 30s.
Mm-hmm.
And he was I think the first person that I found who had a career-ending injury, who got hurt during a game. Again, I don't think that hockey's been a slow-moving change. It's constantly changing, and I don't know that we haven't seen the end of the changes. And so I think that's it is what it is.
Yeah, well, and I was talking, so for me, kind of to give a little bit of reference and background, to me, the amateur era starts ending really in 1926, right? Especially in the stateside, where you have the end of the American Amateur Hockey Association and that group of people. And then you have the influx, that's when the Bruins get started. That's when the New York Rangers and Americans get started. So to me, the end of amateurism, that high level competitive amateurism and the values that go along with it end in mid 20s.
I think there's an argument to be made that, again, it depends on your definition of amateurism. If you've got to work a second job or a third job to play hockey too, we would call it semi-pro, but I don't know.
Well, yeah, they came up with an official definition for semi-pro thanks to MLB and baseball. Okay. So I know that because you're the photos, you actually went to a lot of the places that Jimmy Stewart was in and visited. What one of the places did you go that you actually enjoyed the most? And perhaps this was pre-COVID and you didn't have a chance to make all of the tick marks.
Actually, I did. I made all the tick marks, and I love Brockville.
Okay.
I was really surprised about Brockville. Brockville was a city that hockey historians never really explored. And a lot of the ways that we've done our research has been, okay, a 10-year-old died in 1825 skating on the rink, so they must have had skating here. You see that a lot, especially in New York, where they had the ponds would freeze over, and the kids would skate on it, and the ice wasn't thick enough. And Brockville was kind of ignored because nobody ever drowned. Nobody ever drowned skating, and that's because they had a really interesting thing they did. What they would do is that the adults would bring a heavy cart, and put it on the edge of the St. Lawrence River when the water was frozen. And if the cart stayed afloat, the river was okay to skate on. And as soon as the ice started cracking with the cart, no more skating. And it worked. It seems weird today, but back then kids could skate to New York and back in 5 minutes. No border.
Yeah, the fluidity of the border all the way up until 1920 is pretty amazing.
The other thing that was fascinating about it is Brockville, like the other Canadian cities, built hockey rink. They built one in the 1850s. It wasn't used. The kids would rather skate on the river than skate in the rink. So
no, and you did mention that in the book, and that was a very interesting fact to me. Was that because of the cost, and that Brockville was actually more of a working class town than other aspects, or Was it just,
Brockville's kind of an interesting town. It was a small, back then it was a small town, about 5,000 people, and everybody got along with everybody. They were all in it to build the railroad. Brockville became a hub for as Canada was building its railways. The Oddfellows really kind of of all the cities in Canada, the Oddfellows really resonated with the residents of Brockville. It became more of a unifier than anything else. So I think the fact that they were outdoors, that there was people around, unstructured, when they're all on their lives already had a lot of structure, that was probably the attraction. But I wasn't there then. The research doesn't really, the historical society really didn't have a tremendous amount about it.
mm-hmm.
But a lot of the stories that I heard were kind of hand-me-down stories, or really hockey started here. When I went and met with Bill Fitzel, he was really surprised. He was shocked. He said, "Yeah, nobody's ever looked at Brockville." And I was able to visit him before he passed and showed him and shared with him my info. Mm-hmm. That was before I got to Brockville. So, it just kind of made sense. And it's a kind of town where, when you live a certain way, and you bring that to the big city, sometimes that gets lost. And Jimmy Stewart was just happened to be the right person at the right age at the right time.
Now, and I would like to go back and revisit Oddfellows, or not revisit maybe, but visit the Oddfellows theme mm-hmm. in your book. You mentioned that it's a unifier within the town, but even the way you kind of present it, I was a little surprised that with its name being in the book title, that it wasn't explored more, like its relationship with the Masonic temples, or maybe the Tammany Hall comparison of New York City with the focus on the Irish and changing political willpower while doing all the same things, right? That the Oddfellows and Tammany Hall did all of the same exact kind of help and aid to the people in their towns and districts.
I think at some point I had to make a decision on what direction I wanted to go with this book. And really, I wanted it to be a hockey book about the beginnings of hockey or the evolution of hockey. In order to do that, I kind of felt like Jimmy Stewart was the main character, and that the elements of what made Jimmy Stewart do what Jimmy Stewart did, I think were, growing up was in his household with the Oddfellows, in his family situation, and his dad, and how his dad died a hero. But I think you can go down a lot of rabbit holes anytime you do any research. So I think you gotta kind of pick and choose which ones you're going down and which ones you're going to go with. I really wanted the book to be about him and more about what his contributions were and how he came to be him. But it wasn't really a pure biography either, because it was really more of a biography of a sport. So, your criticisms, I guess, are valid. If somebody else wanted to go down that rabbit hole, like I said, I was trying to keep focus on his contributions to the game. The fact that, unlike most biographies, usually when a biography works, everybody's already heard the person. Mm-hmm. Hey, I'm going to do a story about Wayne Gretzky. Great, I've heard of the guy. People know about the Montreal AAA hockey. Some of the more knowledgeable hockey people know about the AAAs for being the first dynasty. Very few really know any of the details. And some of the articles that have been written about it were just blatantly wrong.
Well, I've almost lost track of a little bit of time. Hopefully it's been about 30 minutes, 35?
Yeah, 37, but yeah.
So with that being said, on one end, I'd like to give you some closing thoughts before I open up to our couple of guests that decided to join us.
Mm-hmm. Closing thought? I don't know. I think I kind of got it all out. I mean, like I said, there is more research to be done on that. But I don't know that the research could ever be found, especially as time goes on.
Thanks, Morey. I think your book makes a good foundation for future research. Well, friends, I see our time is up. If you're interested in today's discussion, Morey's book, The Oddfellow's Heart, is available through Amazon. Also, the next episode will feature Bill Sproul, and we'll be talking about his book, Houghton, The Birthplace of Professional Hockey. If you decide to join me in the parlor, I like hosting a short Q&A session with the author afterwards. Regardless, thanks for joining me on this exploration of hockey's origins.